You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome back to episode 20 of Arsenal Pass. I'm Brendan Patrick, joined always by calling champion Hayden Dale. Hayden, how are you doing?
Good, thanks, Brendan.
Awesome. So this week we're back with one of our class deep dives. For these episodes, Hayden and I dedicate an entire episode to breaking down a specific class and constructed with a focus on core fundamentals, ways to play and build the hero, key cards, strengths and weaknesses, how to win, and ultimately how to beat it. Our fourth installment hails from the Savage Lands, and in our opinion, the most criminally underrated class in all of Flesh and Blood, Brute. But first, Hayden, tell me about your week in Fab.
Most criminally underrated? Yeah, no, I think somewhat agree. Yeah, I mean, this week has been just some testing and played one armory. Yeah, that's kind of been a bit about it, but that's been a good week. How about you, Brendan? I think you've done a bit more than I have this past week.
Yeah, so I got back from Kansas on Monday, actually, and so that event was on, I think it was on Saturday. I was able to win that event. Pretty interesting one. It was about 30 people, so the smallest one I've been to. And because it was 30, it's actually 5 rounds, so just shy of 6.
This is a Road to Nationals, right?
Yeah, this is a Road to Nationals. So yeah, third Road to Nationals win, and 3 for 3 on chain, so 100% on the chain. Only dropped the Bravo. But yeah, it was an interesting group of players because it was essentially most of the players, if not all of them, from the top tables in Oklahoma were just at Kansas. So although it was a smaller field, it did feel a bit tight to get in just because you are on the 5 rounds, so not a lot of room for mistakes. I did go 4-1 in Swiss, and then obviously 3-0 through the top 8 cut and was able to take home the win. So yeah, pretty nice. A lot more chain mirrors than usual just because of how the pairings landed. Yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, sweet. I got to watch your finals match actually on the stream that the store put up, so that was good to see that. And yeah, no, congrats. Good run. Good stuff. You made the trip up. What was it was 30 players, wasn't it? So just on that cusp of that 5 to 6 round, right? So yeah.
Yeah. So I was happy in terms of like my time and energy for it being 5 rounds, but strategically it wasn't great considering, what happens if you take an early loss and that kind of structure. But yeah, that finals match, that was pretty crazy, huh? How was that pivot turn with 0 resources?
Yeah. It looked like you were pretty far ahead, and then your opponent managed to pull out a pretty good turn, a 20 damage turn from sort of nowhere, which was nice for them. But yeah, I think by that point, just the game management sort of saw you through, which was nice.
I was sweating I bet. That. Yeah, I was very far ahead, and then I saw probably one of the most legendary pivot turns in like ever. I think it was off the back of 0 resources. We saw about 20 damage. It was a crazy sequence of Shadow of Ursurs and Bounding Demigons. So yeah, I went from being very, very comfortable to just absolutely sweating and winning by arcane damage in the end.
Yeah,
so,
I think they had one
finals.
I think they had one pitch card to play the Art of War, but yeah, it was once they got into that, they had Shadow versus and Bounding Demigons galore.
Yeah, it was spicy. But yeah, very happy to pick up the 3rd win, and this weekend, I guess, I have 2 more events. This is the end of my Road to Nationals, so I have 4 and 5 this weekend, so Saturday and Sunday, luckily both in Dallas, so see if we can get 2 more wins. If not, no big deal. Calling is coming up, and that is what I'm looking towards.
Yeah, not long now. Basically 2 weeks from when this drops, everyone will be in Vegas who's going and ready to play. Actually, at this time, they'll probably be playing the world premiere sealed event, which is super exciting. Such a cool event to have it at Vegas Calling.
Yeah, very, very excited for that, to say the least. Kind of being able to play, what seems to be like a flagship limited format. For the first time and in such a kind of an awesome atmosphere. I think it's going to be, I don't know, it's going to be memorable. It's definitely going to be memorable. I'm very excited for the Arsenal Pass limited review as well.
Yeah, well, hey, you'll have the knowledge this time. You have the insider scoop from being in Vegas.
For sure. All right, Hayden, take us into the news.
Yeah, well, first piece we've got to talk about is we're talking about Tales of Aria. We've got 3 spoiler cards, so some early spoilers for all the fans out there. Official previews don't actually start until Wednesday, this coming Wednesday. So LSS provided 3 creators with spoilers. So the Lexi hero that we'd already seen the art of, where James White had already talked about Lexi. It was speculated that Lexi was the Ranger, and then we got that confirmed with the spoiler that came out on, was it 3 days ago now? And then we know it's an elemental ranger, so really exciting. We see the elemental ability. What's the word? Just talent. Just blank for a second.
Yeah, there you go.
And so we know that within that, there's what people have speculated around, like sub talents, I guess, with the elements is kind of what seems to be happening with Essence. So Lexi has Essence of Ice and Lightning. I'm sure there'll be a third Essence, and then we'll see what happens from there. So yeah, really really cool. We also saw Shiver, which is Lexi's weapon, her bow, and also a elemental card in the form of Weave Lightning. So yeah, really.
Yeah, Hayden, super excited with the preview of the weapon. Actually, we can see that the new Ranger is already able to kind of interact at instant speed with that weapon. I know both me and you are huge instant speed fans, big Kano players, so that stuff gets me really excited. I mean, already the hero looks incredible. Kind of Go Again on demand has, I'm going to put in quotations, historically shown to be pretty good. So already seeing this on Lexi, it looks like it's a very, very powerful hero ability. And then we can only, we're not going to speculate too much. It's outside of the scope of this pod, maybe in time in the round. But Frostbite, whatever it may be, I think it may be a bit of a hoser to having multiple attacks on the chain, whether that's, reduced by a certain amount of damage for each attack. You take damage for playing out attacks, or maybe even stopping Go Again past a certain extent altogether. Who knows? But sounds pretty spicy.
Yeah, you're giving a lot of people. I've heard that from a lot of people, and that's what people want. I feel like that'd be
really?
quite strong, but we'll see what happens. Yeah, Weave Lightning, also a really cool card. The first action that we've seen, so it's a lightning action. I think is really sweet as well. So it's a buff card, but it says Entwine on it. So sorry, not Entwine, Fuse on it. So yeah, we'll see what happens there. I was just looking at the art, and I was like, oh, that's such a cool art. And I said Entwine, but Fuse, yeah, we'll see what happens there. But now, when the pod drops, basically we're 5 days out from previews. So, and just to talk about preview, we have our preview card on the 3rd. So Friday is going to be our preview card dropping. I don't know. I need to check the exact time. I believe that's New Zealand time. So it would drop probably just before or after the pod. So we will let you know. We'll drop a note on the socials and let you know what time that's dropping exactly. You know what? Before the end of the pod, I will have checked, and we will say at the end of the pod what time it is dropping.
So I have communed with the deities at LSS, and it is a Ranger spoiler, and it does allow for 2 Arsenals. Hence, it's coming to Arsenal Pass. It's going to be really funny if I'm actually correct, and then it looks like I just spoiled the card way too early, and I get in trouble. But totally speculating, but I'm hoping that it has something to do with the Arsenal, and we have been thinking multiple Arsenals, so maybe we'll land around there. Sorry, I said we're not going to speculate, but I'm just getting excited. Hot and bothered here.
You just
on a Wednesday.
Yeah. You just want to. That's so funny. Yeah, it would be thematic, right? Yeah, so we don't actually have a set. I'm just checking. We don't have a set time for ours, but ours is on September 3rd. So we might get a time close to it. I don't know. So we'll be dropping that. I'm really excited. I haven't seen the card yet, but I imagine we will very, very soon.
Very, very excited. Awesome. So want to shout out some of our YouTube stuff that's been coming out. We had a Rhinar versus Dash gameplay go up and a Bolton versus Bravo. Both are really tight games, but I think the Bolton versus Bravo is really one that you can't miss. It was one of the kind of the more incredible games that I've actually ever had the pleasure of playing. So I don't want to spoil too much because you will definitely be surprised with the depth that game goes in the end game. And definitely check it out. Arsenal Pass YouTube channel. Been having a huge push for YouTube recently. Seen amazing support climbing up there. Into the 1.5, closing in on 2K subscribers soon. Who knows when Hayden will dye his hair? We'll have to see. It's just going to be a tattoo on his forehead eventually because he's dodged it for so long.
Who knows when Hayden's going to get a lockdown? That's the question.
Yeah. Speaking of YouTube, do you want to give a shout out to our Patreon? We launched that, I think it's about a week ago now. We had our first deck guide go up. That is for the Bravo deck. And we're talking, full deck list, sideboard guide, deck theory, some math, and then just everything you need to know if you want to pick up that deck, bring it to an event, and be competitive. We also had the first kind of Patreon exclusive podcast that is going to be live by the time I think that this podcast is live. And that is the 3 main things you need to win a calling. And of course, coming from the infamous calling champion himself, Hayden Dale. And then I also pipe in a few times as a calling runner-up myself. But obviously, Hayden Dale's masterclass on how to win a calling. I took some tips myself, and I'm ready to go to Vegas.
Well, can you go one bidder this time, and then
Yeah, just one more spot. So anyway, Hayden, no Command and Cookout this week. We did have an awesome amount of questions last week for our mailbag. I think it was almost near 100. So we were really, really pleased with that. But we'll be taking those into time in the round. But for the sake of these class deep dives being quite long, we're just going to head straight into the main topic of the pod.
Yeah. Just one thing before we head into the main topic, Brendan. Just wanted to share our release schedule. So our release schedule's had a bit of an update. When I say a bit of an update, I mean we have a set release schedule now for our gameplay videos, for our deck tech videos, for our for time in the round, and for the pod. So the pod's always been the same. Always comes out at the same time, which is at Thursdays at 8 p.m. CST. Which is 11 a.m. in Australia, which is 1 p.m. Friday in New Zealand. And then time in the round has been pretty consistent, and we're going to keep that time slot, which is that's Saturday 11 a.m. CST, and that ends up being 2 a.m. for myself here in Australia and 4 a.m. for New Zealand. So on Sunday morning, that's up and there for you. And then gameplay. So gameplay is coming out on Tuesday mornings in the US, so in North America. So we're going to stick to those slots going forward. Just wanted to let everyone know in case they are wondering if we're sporadic or we're a bit more organized. We're more organized now, Brendan.
Sweet, yeah. Mark your calendars. Get ready for this. I mean, it's just been really good with the kind of the consistent release schedule, getting consistent gameplay out, consistent pods, consistent deck techs. That is one thing we've kind of always strived to do since we created the channel or the podcast, whatever you want to call it. But now we're adding on the the gameplay and the deck techs, just helping trying to help you guys level up.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, main topic it is. So we are discussing our guide to Brute, our Brute 101. So we're calling this the beast within, awakening the beast within. So the Brute class is is pretty unique, as a lot of classes are in this game. We think about the 3 heroes that we have currently for Brute in the form of Rhinar and KO as the young hero, and then the Shadow Brute and Levia. It's one of the things that comes to mind when you think about Brute first is those additional costs, right? And often one thing that does pop into people's head is, there's this random aspect to Brute. He's wrecking everywhere. He's raging through the Savage Lands and just smashing things at random, etc. So Brute, that sort of thing comes to mind first, I think, which is really interesting. But when you dive into the class further, it's a lot more than that, right? So there are these additional costs of the discards, and we see that sort of has changed as we've gone from Rhinar and Welcome to Wraith through to what that looks like with Levia and Monarch. So Rhinar has these, or I guess Levia has some more appropriately costed cards, and the risk is a little bit less, right? So with Brute and Welcome to Wraith, there was a lot of additional cost is discard a random card from your hand. Whereas with Levia, we see a lot of the stuff which is draw and discard. We've seen Pulping come in, we've seen Shadow Blasphemous, so Deadwood Rumbler, these cards, and these help fill up the grave, of course, for Levia, which she's all about. But we also see Dominate become like a really key form of evasion with Levia. But in Welcome to Wraith, for instance, we saw it really be around about the Intimidate mechanic, which is Rhinar's key mechanic. With that sort of, that chaos ensuing, right? Taking your opponent's cards at random so that their turn gets thrown into a bit of chaos, and they can't probably do exactly what they want to do in terms of defending and attacking because their hand is kind of been torn apart to a degree. KO.
So Hayden, I've heard. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to finish.
Actually, this leads right into KO because I've heard you say random a lot, but I want to ask you: is Brute a random class? Is it a high variance class? Do I play this? There's a lot of dice rolling. There's a lot of extra action points, no extra action points, and maybe sometimes doubling my attack. Is Brute? Is there a lot of RNG?
I don't think so. I think that's the kind of perception of Brute as a class, is that it's an RNG class. But I couldn't disagree more. And we're going to talk about the reasons why that is the case. But at a top level, basically, it's that Flesh and Blood has variance, right? And there is aspects of variance within the game, but they all come from different parts. So card draws one, resource ratios and costs are one, additional costs or banish effects like Chain's banish effect. Like these are all things that can have variance play into them, and Brute's no exception to that. It's just that Brute's always looks a lot more obvious to people, right? It's it's a random discard. Well, is it random if you only have one card in hand? Oh, Scabskins is a random dice roll. Well, do you need to be rolling Scabskins? There's all these trade-offs. So we're going to talk about that more as we get into it. But I don't, personally, and I think, Brennan, you share this opinion, Brute is no more, I guess, of an RNG class than other classes out there.
Yeah, sometimes less so too, which is the funny part.
Yes, yeah, exactly, which we will talk about as well. Except maybe our friend KO. So KO is the interesting one, and I think KO really, I guess, backs into that chaos side. And I mean, it's in the name, right? KO is a berserker, so that's where you see maybe a little bit of a departure of that. But Levia, she's a smarter Brute, right? And Rhinar even to an extent. So yeah, excited to talk about that. But I did actually say, I think most importantly, it's not a dice roll class. It's not an RNG class, and actually, it is one of the more difficult and intricate classes in Flesh and Blood, especially the way that you structure turns and actually structure your deck. So yeah, all right, Brennan.
Awesome. Yeah. So now into my favorite section, which is going to be the history of Brute. Brute has one of my favorite histories in Flesh and Blood out of most classes because of the way it was treated in Welcome to Wraith.
Mm-hmm.
The way when I say the way it was treated, the way it was disregarded. So Welcome to Wraith constructed saw we talked about the class being criminally underrated. I mean, that is exactly what it was in Welcome to Wraith. So Welcome to Wraith, as most of you know by now, was dominated by Warrior and Ninja for the most part, and then there was Guardian close behind, and then far behind that Guardian was the Brute. So Brute may have had a bit of a tougher matchup into, maybe into more mid-range aggressive Dorinthia lists and maybe into Ninja as well. But it was the perfect theoretical counter to the most powerful deck in that format, which was discovered a bit late. There's going to be Ninja Control or Ninja Turtle. So Ninja with Drone of Brutality, focusing on a control strategy. That deck, what it wanted to see the least across from it was Brute. But as it turns out, at that calling, there was very, very few Brute players, and Mr. Hayden Dale himself was not able to show up. And I think you would have been piloting Brute. Is that correct?
Would have been close. I actually never decided on the deck I would have played because I couldn't go, but it was tossing up between Brute and Guardian in the end. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And do you agree that Brute was a little bit underplayed and maybe underrated in that format?
I have the metagame actually. So at the Auckland calling in that year, so that was the very start of 2020. Dorinthia and Katsu were both about 33% of the meta at that event, and then Guardian was sitting at around 25%, and then Rhinar was sitting way down in less than 20%. So Rhinar was really underrepresented at that calling, and no Rhinar into top 8. So Dorinthia, Bravo, Katsu all represented in that top 8. But just in general, Rhinar was not heavily played in that format. It was definitely one of the least. It was definitely probably the least played class in that format. So yeah, really interesting.
And I believe that was the first deck tech kind of video that Legendary Studios did. The first video they released was an OTK Rhinar build, which to an extent is actually probably the only reason that Rhinar may have been over 5% or 10% of the callings, because a lot of people are on that OTK Rhinar build with the barraging beatdowns and just coming in for unblockable damage at the end. That deck looks very, very slow for that format. I mean, it's very, very I didn't think it was strong enough, but we did see a lot of people pull it out because it was fun. I think if that hadn't been released, we may have seen even less Brute, which is crazy because the class was actually really, really strong in Welcome to Wraith. And it was, I mean, I don't think maybe it wasn't the best pick for the first tournament, right? Where Ninja Control was just 2 decks, but later in that format, when, more people picked up that deck, Brute would have been a great pick.
Yeah, I think it's also just really misunderstood exactly what Rhinar was about in that format. There was, I think people did have that perception of a dice roll class, use your scab skins and go to town. But I think actually what Rhinar was really the powerful sort of Rhinar decks in that form are actually more control decks, to be honest. You have Club, which is one of the most efficient weapons with the Romping Club, which is the 2 cost 4. And it gets +1 if you've discarded a card with 6 or greater. And you had some really powerful setups for in-game with Blood Rush Bellows and Alpha Rampages and Barrage Beatdowns. So a deck actually could play a pretty good control plan. It just wasn't the way that people looked at it because of the discard elements, which was really interesting.
Awesome. Yeah. So I know that in Arcane Rising, not too many things changed, but I really want to just kind of skip to Crucible because that was a meta that I didn't get to play, but where Brute got very, very interesting. Specifically, Crucible added. Go ahead.
I just want to say one thing about Arcane Rising. I think we saw Rhinar get a little bit more play to an extent in Arcane Rising, and it actually didn't really get any tools. The only sort of tools that it got were Skullcap. Command and Cookout and maybe Skullcap from that format, but I think people started to understand the class a lot more as the game sort of grew, which was a bit interesting. And then that leads into what you're talking about, which is Crucible of War.
Yeah, a meta that I wasn't able to play very much, but I know the tales of the infamous Dash deck, right? And I'm pretty sure the Dash deck had a little bit of a boogeyman in the format in the form of Rhinar, but we didn't see it too much. I know you worked on that deck. You're very passionate about the deck that was created back then that did, quote unquote, have a good matchup or counter the popular mech decks that were running around.
Yeah, I mean, I think from so far, Rhinar was just at its strongest in Crucible. I think that that format, the way that it played out with so many people moving to these Dash decks and people still playing, a lot of Dorinthia, I think that Rhinar was really well positioned. And even to an extent, people were playing, these... it was at the point where people were still playing a lot of defensive decks, so a lot of defense reactions were still can be played in decks. People still hadn't quite worked out how to set up these, these 5-card hands or work out these mid game plans that sort of allow them to cycle through decks and have these power turns. And what Rhinar did really well in that format was basically Crucible, bought you Mandible Claws, which were these really powerful weapons that allowed you to set up 5-card hands and pair with Bloodrush Bellows. And just do really powerful things. And then of course you had that card Arg Smash, which was pretty. I know you want to talk about that when we get into it, so I'll just kind of leave that for Brennan or Steel's Glory. But the deck basically was something that could really punish these Dash decks, do really well against the Warrior decks, just because of the ability to. It was kind of weird. And in essence, I never thought that Dorinthia was a good matchup for Rhinar, but I think the way that that deck was able to pivot by using both Romping Club and Claws was really interesting. And of course, you got the Gambler's Gloves in that set as well, which allowed you to actually play a bit more aggressively into some of these decks like Dorinthia. So yeah, it got a lot of tools. I mean, Beast was in a really powerful card as well. And we just saw it was really weird. I think Rhinar was so criminally underplayed in that format, given the fact that Dash was the most the most popular and the most successful deck in that format. That people weren't playing more Rhinar, but I think it just wasn't as clear to people how to build the Rhinar decks and what to do with it.
100%. And I want to quickly, and usually we're going to talk about a fun fact with this one. Hayden, I don't know if you're aware, but there was actually a Brute that won a calling. 10-0 actually. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. I've heard he's a bit washed up, trying to make his way back in. Big 2/2 kind of drop player.
Yeah. I've heard.
You got any kind of lore on the history of that Brute 10-0?
Yeah. So that was me. That's the washed up guy.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. Wow. Weird.
So the calling that I won was a limited calling. I played Brute the whole day, so Brute and Sealed, and I actually ended up falling into a seat in Draft, which provided me a pretty good Brute deck as well, which then took on. So yeah, it was a nice 10-0 run over the day for that event with Rhinar. And I think the thing I felt like when I was playing that event with Rhinar, like I wasn't playing to any RNG hands, wasn't playing to these like discard hands, was trying to like stack my deck. Had been like told a few things by some players who had played in Auckland and had been testing that helped me a lot. Jason Long being one of those players. He actually played Brute as well on the day, and we played I think in like the second to last round. I think we were both basically locked for top 8. Played in a Brute mirror where Jason Long slapped me for I think 19 damage on turn 1. He had a massive turn. I can't even remember there's a picture out there. James White like stopped the game and like took a picture of it because it was on the King of the Hill table. I think it was the second to last round. I was X and O, and I think Jason had maybe had one loss. And I think I lost. I think I won the die roll, chose to go second. And then Jason just like laid down this like massive turn. And it was pretty epic. But yeah, so Brute took it in the day. My my draft was quite strong. I had 2 Drone Brutalities in my draft deck. I just had like a really good Romping Club deck that was like super efficient.
Somebody just passed them, right? There's a very cool video out there. Actually, I think it's from that calling where somebody was drafting Brute and passing those Drone Brutalities.
I think that's Sasha.
Is it? No way.
Yeah, I think that's from Sasha's one. No, yeah. Maybe there is. I don't know. I actually don't know.
No, it is Sasha. He does pass multiple Drone Brutalities,
Okay.
I believe.
I did not. I took both the ones that came my way. So I took one second pick, and I took one. I think I got a like 4th or 5th pick. I got a yellow and a red in that draft. So yeah.
I just can't believe it. That's how you know they were old school. They were just passing Drone Brutalities. Probably the quintessential pick one, pack one card that has ever existed. But anyway, Hayden, enough of the fun facts. Congratulations on your win. So far in the
It's only 2.5 years ago now.
Yeah, it's only 2. But take me in how to build the deck.
Yeah, I can do that. So how to build brutes. We're going to do what we always do, which is we're gonna start by talking through key cards in Brute. And you know what? There's three sets that have Brute specific cards, thanks to Monarch. So there is quite a bit to talk about. So we won't go into every single Brute card, but there is some really iconic cards. There's some really important cards to all forms of Brute, whether that be for Rhinar, KO, or Levia. But we will be focusing as per usual, mostly on classic constructed. So Levia and Rhinar. But yeah, let's get into it with Welcome to Wraith, Brennan. And we're just going to go straight for the card, Scabskin Leathers. We're just going to get straight in with the equipment.
So all dice rolls got to roll at every turn, and I've got to hit a 6 if I ever want to win a game. Is that correct?
Definitely correct.
Okay,
no,
sure. I just want to make sure I was understanding what you're saying.
I mean, I guess that was the way that Brute was really played, as people built around the Scabskin leathers initially. People were even playing to the extent where people were playing like a really heavy generics deck, just utilizing Scabskin leathers, with like just the good generics, right?
Snatch. Oh, off 2 action points.
Exactly. But then I think people really sort of understand what Scabskin leathers is, and that's a tool, right? So the times where you want to utilize your Scabskin leathers is where it's basically free or it's a really low opportunity cost. So if your turn would be, say 4, come on with a club. If you say rolled a 2 or 3 on your Scabskin leathers, if you roll a 4, 5, or 6, then your turn is actually coming for maybe 12. Those are the sort of turns where you're looking to utilize your Scabskin leathers. The other times where Scabskin leathers are really useful for you is you're up against a control deck that can't pressure you on the way back. So say you did roll that 1. Your control opponent with 5 cards who's got 3 defense reactions in hand or 2 defense reactions plus 2 blues can only come in for 4 to 6 damage. But you would have been coming in for 16 to 20 damage if you'd hit. So that's a really key way to use it. And the other thing is that Scabskin leathers can get you out of some tight spots, right? So it's most important to look at this card not as a game plan to completely build around necessarily, but if you are you're starting to fall behind and you need to be a bit more risky with your hands, you need to keep more cards and try and push back damage. Well, Scabskin leathers can be a tool to utilize in those situations. But yeah, I mean, if I look at Scabskin leathers in, say, a Welcome to Wraith or an Arcane Rising format, and I was playing against an aggro deck, I was probably rolling that max once per game. That in those matchups where you could be severely punished by rolling a 1, to the point where it could probably lose you the game, I didn't need to roll them. I had my deck set up for those matchups. I was relying on a different plan, but then I was playing against control. On the other hand, this is where I can start to utilize this as a tool in this matchup. So yeah, Scabskin leathers I think are really probably the least understood legendary initially. I think we're starting to see it become a lot more understood now. But yeah, interesting card.
Can't deny its incredible blocking value in that format as well.
Huge.
Fantastic card. And like you said, I mean, the theoretical power ceiling on that card is extremely high. But very interesting as we've progressed from Welcome to Wraith to now to like where, back then it was very, very much higher risk with no Gambler's Gloves. And nowadays it is so much a tool and it can be a bit more of a forgiving tool with those Gambler's Gloves. But Hayden, I want to talk about my top 5 favorite cards, I think, in the game. And sitting pretty close to number 1 there, it's going to be Sand Sketch Planned. This is kind of a marquee majestic out of Welcome to Wraith. I can't see if it's a majestic or a super, but I believe
it's a super. It was printed as a super in Welcome to Wraith. Yeah, exactly.
Rhinar specialization, so unfortunately can't play it in my Levia deck, but a tutor where you get 2 action points almost on demand here.
Yeah, I mean, Sandsketch Plan is a really interesting card in the fact that it's another one of those ones that on the surface looks like you've got to gamble to get what you need, right? But, the beauty of this card is that it's a blue. So you can pitch this card early, you can get it back late game, and you've pitched some nice sixes either side of it. There you go and find your power card, and then whether that be something like an Alpha Rampage or, more I guess commonly recently was Beast Within with Crucible. But even, back in the day, you could weigh up that risk if you had, say, a 4-card hand, you play the Sandsketch Plan, you got 3 6 attacks. Scavs it was correct to go and get a setup card that wasn't a 6 attack, and you would make the gamble similar to what you do with Scavs Skin Leathers in so many ways. So the card is super versatile, being a blue, a card that blocks for defense for 3 and as a shooter, and gets you 2 action points. So that could really kickstart some really big turns. Sandsketch Plan, I love that card. It's probably one of my favorite cards, to be honest.
Yep, super fun, and with the addition of Beast Within, I mean, oh gosh, that card is fun to play with.
Yeah.
But Hayden, speaking of specializations, we do have, I think, one of the most iconic cards of Welcome to Wraith, even though it's a bit underplayed, probably. But that's Alpha Rampage, big damage, with the inherent evasion on the card, with the Intimidate. What's kind of your opinion of Alpha Rampage, where it is today, and also where it used to be?
Yeah, I think if you're playing Rhinar, I don't think there's any reason to not be playing this card. It pairs so well with so many of the other cards that you can play out of Rhinar. So, everything from Scab Skin Leathers even to Barraging Beatdowns to Awakening Bellows to Blood Rush Bellow. Like, this card pairs with so many things so well. Sandsketch Plan even it pairs well with because you can go and get Sandsketch Plan, get the first trigger off Intimidate, then play your Alpha Rampage, get 2 more Intimidate triggers, and you're leaving your opponent with maximum 1 card in hand, potentially really difficult to block Alpha Rampage. A really good finisher in that format. A really good way to push damage against control decks. I think in general it's been a card that people would say is less good against the aggressive decks because of the return rate, right? It's effectively 3 cards for 9 damage if you look at it as if the Intimidate doesn't matter. So the Intimidate is the really key thing about Alpha Rampage. If you're using it with the Intimidate effect not really having any impact, so you're playing against a deck that doesn't want to block anyway, you're paying 3 cards for 9 damage, which is not a great rate for where you want to be, especially in a format as we've seen the game slowly grow in power.
Mm-hmm. And finally, I think this is the most iconic Brood card in existence at the moment. The old Blood Rush Bellow.
Yeah,
the Blood Rush Bellow. I mean, this card, it was awesome back before Crucible, and then after they printed the claws. I mean, Blood Rush Bellow claw for 10, and then come in with an attack after that is it's pretty iconic.
Yeah, I mean, for 1 card to be able to do that, right? So if you take it. Actually, let's just start with Rhinar, right? If you play this in Rhinar, you're probably getting 1 to 2 Intimidates. You, like you say, if it's with the claws, which is where you want to be, you're coming in for minimum 10 plus probably 8, so 18 damage off, a 4-card hand with Blood Rush Bellows. So this card really, really powerful. We've only seen it sort of grow in its usefulness into Levia as well. We've seen people play claws builds. It is a card that can do a lot of work, but even on other weapons like the Rompy Club, it's still really effective, especially if you have extra action points. So yeah, Blood Rush Bellow is I think just such a cool build around card. Really, I wonder if in the design process if this card always pitched for 2, if it was always a yellow card, because I do wonder if maybe at some point maybe this was a red or even a blue and it was way too powerful. I'm not sure, but I think yellow is just right.
Yeah, 100%. So in Welcome to Wraith, there are going to be some very, very very iconic cards, but why don't you take us into the next one?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a special mention to Reckless Swing and Savage Feast. I think those are and Barrage and Beatdown. I think those 3 cards are really interesting cards that have done a lot of work, especially for Rhinar, but for the Brute class in general. Reckless Swing, a really unique defense reaction that has that additional cost. Barrage and Beatdown is I would say predominantly a Rhinar card because of the Intimidate effect. But, there was definitely decks that could stack those in games of Barrage Beatdown. That was one of Rhinar's favorite win conditions, especially in, Welcome to Wraith, Arcane Rising, even into Crucible format. So, yeah, I think those cards are just very strong cards that we'll continue to see as Brute grows.
I do want to have a quick little shout out to my favorite draft archetype in the game. It's called Yellow Bellow. So basically you draft a bunch of yellow-ish primeval bellows, and it's freaking hilarious. You just swing the club for like 8+ every single turn. It's so strong. So I remember when I went over to New Zealand, I was at Legendary Studios and we did a draft in house. So we had James, Jason, Chris, like all the developers, and then me and Sasha and my partner at the time. And I remember I didn't understand this concept of being like archetypes in the Welcome to the Draft format. It was just obviously I pretty much never drafted. I was coming from North America, but yeah. And then James White played Yellow Bellow, and dude, the archetype is so strong. It's so fun to play, and it's incredible.
I've won quite a few drafts with that archetype, just taking all the yellow 6 attacks and taking all the primeval bellows you can, and going to town.
Yeah, my favorite.
All right, Crucible of War, Brennan. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the Mandible Claws already, just the power of those cards, but they have been so important to Brute as a class, whether that be Rhinar, whether that be KO, whether that be Levia. Just this effect, that you have two-handed weapons that can get go again. At first I think the costs look kind of restrictive, but it actually works quite well into the framework of what the deck wants to do. Say you have access to 2 blues on a turn, generally with like a discard that works really well. Mandible Claws I think are probably some of my favorite weapons we've had printed.
Yeah, I really like them with the Blood Rush Bellow. That combination has definitely been a joy to play with. But let's talk about Beast Within.
Yeah,
we did mention it quickly, but Beast Within was, I think, probably one of the coolest cards to come out of Crucible of War. Just being able to discard that and get all that value of banishing and putting another card into your hand, sometimes a resource card. Honestly, can't say no. So fetching this off Sand Sketch, discarding this a Blood Rush Bellow, just incredible power here.
Yeah, and this is where some of the perceived, I guess, even more of that randomness comes in, right? With Beast Within, it's like, okay, well, I hit the Beast Within, now I banish cards off the top of my deck until I find that 6 attack. Well, I've just banished 4 non-attacks off the top of my deck and taken 4 damage. I've just hit the red card and I needed a blue card. And, I mean, to be honest, that's the same as any variance when you go and draw a card. I think the thing with Beast Within is that damage aspect, right? It needs to be managed, so it really comes down to deck building, which I think is so important for cards like Beast Within. And it's really funny. I think there's this whole thing where you would look at, if you were really new to the game and you were building a deck, you would go, okay, I'm building a Brute. I'm going to go look at all the Brute cards. And you probably build a deck that ends up being better than what people at the next stage would do, which is really funny, which is people at the next stage would go, oh, well, actually, I'm going to go and put all the most powerful cards into my deck. And it takes away from the theme. Even not only does it take away from the thematic aspects of the class, but it probably takes you away from like the synergistic aspects of the class, which is really important for cards like Beast Within or Blood Rush Bellows, things like this, where Brute needs to manage the amount of 6 attacks it has in its deck, and so that means it needs to manage how many like non-attacks it has in its deck as well. And when we see with Levia, it even has to manage how many blood deck cards and how many cards banished from grave it has from its deck. So Beast Within really falls into one of those like just I guess like classic Brute cards where you look at it and you need to evaluate your deck building to get the most out of it. But I mean, this card is so strong. It's one of the most, when I saw this card spoiled, I was like so excited for Brute.
And remember when I opened this card, I was like, oh my god.
Yeah.
So excited to play Brute and Blitz after I saw that.
I mean, you discard it, right? It replaces itself. So you might get a red, you might get a yellow, you might get a blue, but as well, if you're on the second cycle of your deck, you probably know what you're getting. You oftentimes know what you're playing towards as well. So just the fact that it replaces itself for an effect like Savage Feast or Blood Rush Bellows or whatever it might be is super powerful. And then just on that, Brendan, I mean, you move to Massacre, which has a similar effect, right? When it's discarded, it gives you a buff, which is in that case gives you the +2 attack and intimidate. It gives you the Intimidate, and if you play it, it gives you the +2 attack as well, plus the Intimidate. Massacre, a really interesting card. So, yeah, I think it's probably one that I think has been less utilized because it's a red, because it needs to be done off an attack action. So, hitting it off of a Blood Rush Bellows, for instance, or a Primeval Bellow, whatever it might be, or a Sandsketch Plan, doesn't actually give you the buff. But for Rhinar, I think especially Massacre is very important.
Yeah. Really, really powerful card, and also kind of like this. Seems like it's like the budget Alpha Rampage sometimes,
Definitely
as well. I think you're playing it out, but I want to talk about this card, Arc Smash. So the effect is cool, right? We enjoy it, like it's a cool effect. But this is, I mean, we look at this, we kind of zoom out a bit. This is the most literal hate card that I think has ever been printed in Flesh and Blood. It's got a very, very obvious use to it, and it was very relevant in the metagame that it was printed.
Yeah, definitely. It's when I saw this card, everyone was like, I mean, this is just the Dash killer, right? So Dash had been dominating the Arcane Rising meta. Actually, not even to the extent weirdly that it was in Crucible, but it was doing very well. There was control decks, and I think a big aspect of that, as we talked about, was the fact that 5-card hand decks and things like that just hadn't quite been worked out yet, and Dash was just efficient. You could just always do the thing that you need to do every turn, and then so Arc Smash gets printed, and then the calls are Dash is dead, new meta, and then that doesn't quite end up being the case, but I don't think that's because of Arc Smash. I think that's just because of how Brutes were built in that format. Arc Smash, very powerful card, has utility against. I've seen people play this against decks that play potions, set up decks as well, because it does pitch for yellow. So it always it's never dead. Pitches for yellow, blocks for 3. But that first thing is just the roll a 6-sided dice, destroy up to X mechanologist items. Oh, sorry, it doesn't say that, but
X mechanologist. Jeez. What about my rusted relics and be popping that off the board?
Exactly, yeah, or your timestamp potions, but super super interesting card, Arc Smash, and I expect actually in the future to see more utility for Arc Smash. I think items are clearly something that LSS are going to explore in the future.
Any more honorable mentions for Crucible War before we breeze by Monarch here?
Yeah, the only one for me is Barraging Bighorn. I think that's, as a yellow card, is just almost always slotted into Rhinar decks, but actually has a lot of utility, that card. So it presents Go Again as an on-hit if the opponent isn't blocking with... It's actually funny, this is the... we saw a lot of block by less than 2 non-equipment cards as we've gone through the set. So we saw Barraging Beatdown, and then we saw Barraging Bighorn, and then we saw Pulping as well in Monarch. So really cool. I really like that effect of forcing your opponent to potentially block in ways that they don't want to, especially if you're playing Rhinar, where you've probably intimidated a card from their hand. You throw a bit of chaos even more. So you've intimidated a random card from their hand. Could well have been a card they wanted to defend with. Now they need to defend with 2 cards, otherwise you Go Again. Just causes your opponent to have to do some things that aren't ideal. Intimidate is a mechanic that's very good against good players, because good players get better at structuring their hands, structuring their turns. So if you take away cards from their hands, it makes it a lot more difficult for them to play out the lines that they want to go for.
100%. As we head into Monarch, obviously we were provided with Levia, and Hayden will have plenty to say about that. But before we get into Levia, Hayden, let's talk about some of the brute generics here. We'll talk about the weapon last. So starting out with the non-attack actions and attack actions, we have the set of no blocks, right? So all the brute cards in Monarch that are generic brute that is, do not block. So we have Smash the Big Tree, Pulping, and Tear Limb from Limb. Pulping, I remember this is actually one of the earlier cards that spoiled in Monarch. This one got me real excited. So being able to gain Dominate off that discard, and then if, due to the Dominate's effect, or potentially due to the amount of cards your opponent is willing to block with, / what they have in hand, Pulping can get Go Again. So very exciting card.
Yeah, I really like Pulping. It's a card I was really keen to play with. I think the first week that when it came out, I had a Blitz event and I just built up a Rhinar deck with Pulpings, and it was basically just my old Rhinar deck, but Pulping and Tear Limb from Limb, and I just had so much fun playing it. To be honest, it's really interesting the thematic sort of design aspect that LSS went with for the brute generics to not block in this format, because you could say that if you're following thematically, the rest of them have defended even though they're generic brute cards. But I think it really fits in with Levia in this format. And then you see the power level trade-off, right? So and traditionally the additional cost you have at a 2, you wouldn't get a 2 cost for 6 would have an additional drawback, right? Like Barraging Beatdown, where you have that discarded card. So with these, they are vanilla. They've got some really nice text on there, like Smash the Big Tree. I love that card. And then so you trade off that extra power for not being able to defend.
Yeah, I think Pulping was one of those ones that seems like it slotted into every brute deck as soon as it came out that wasn't a control deck, which was every brute deck. I felt like this would be really a chase card for brutes that were looking to play Blitz after kind of week 1. But Hayden, what do you think of the Ravenous Meat Axe? We see Levia, and we're going to get into Levia, but we see Levia played quite a bit nowadays, but almost always without the Meat Axe. What is your kind of theoretical use case for this weapon outside of limited?
I think Meat Axe is actually a pretty important use case, which is the fact that it allows you to get cards into your graveyard. So there are certain matchups where your opponent isn't going to. So actually, let's take Kano for example. Kano is not going to present physical attacks to you, so you're not going to be able to block and get cards into your graveyard, and it's going to be a lot harder to maybe start your turn. So most of the decks in the format want to be pretty attacking from their turn 1 or turn 2. Maybe if they're on the turn 0, they won't. But from turn 1, they want to be. Whereas, you've got some decks like Kano, Viscerai OTK, which doesn't want to do that. And that's where I think the Medex is kind of a card that you might need for those matchups, or if you're expecting those decks to be prevalent in the format, is you need a way to start to fuel your grave outside of just generic or 6s, those cards that don't have the banishes, the additional cost. And then once you get the ball rolling, it doesn't matter too much. But if you don't have a way to start it, it can be very difficult, and that's where Ravenous Medex can be really important.
Awesome. So Hayden, I know this one's going to hit close to home, but I've conferred with the community, and we've decided we've decided as a collective that Levia is the worst character. It's worse than Ranger. It's unplayable. You can't play it. It's absolutely terrible and constructed. Hayden, I know you definitely agree with us, and I welcome you into the Brotherhood, into the Covenant, where we believe that Levia is unplayable. So talk to me about it.
I mean, I don't believe that.
I know, and now you got to prove me wrong. Tell me why Levia is good. Tell me why Levia is slept on. Why is this the deck that nobody's playing that more people should?
I don't know if necessarily more people should, because I think Levia is actually a very difficult hero to play in constructed. But I think it's a lot. Its credit level is it's not been credited with quite as much as it should. Levia has this inherent ability with the fact that Blood Debt stacks up, and you can't play it out of banish for the most part, which is really scary, right? It's like playing Kano. You start with 30 life, and Levia has that aspect where you've got this inevitability, that a thing that your opponent can play to that can really hurt you, which makes Levia more difficult to play. But you flip side that, Levia has some really powerful cards and some really powerful interactions. The ability to continuously recycle cards from your graveyard into banish and then replay them, whether that be cards like Deeper Evil or Howl from Beyond, Tome of Torment. These cards are really, really powerful. And then alongside that, you have attacks that are super efficiently costed with this additional effect. You've got Endless Maw that can, 3 costs come in for 9. We talked about Alpha Rampage being, a bad rate card if you think about it just in terms of damage. Well, Endless Maw is 2 cards for 9 damage. That's a lot more efficient. You got Boneyard Marauder, which is a 1 for 6. Like the power level on these cards with that additional cost is really strong. So that's, I think, where Levia is most potent, I think. And the more difficult thing probably for Levia so far has just been how these decks have been built. I think people have tried to build more setup decks, I think, to start with. Whereas Levia sort of just wants to hit the pedal pretty early, I think, and just go for it. So I wouldn't say initially I think more people should play it because it's super fun and it's really powerful, but it is a more difficult class to play. I would actually put Levia probably in the top 3 most difficult heroes to play at this point, I think, in the current class constructed format.
Interesting. So would your kind of final conclusion there be, in the People versus Hayden deal, that Levia is very playable in the Monarch format and is actually a competitive deck, right? You could take it to a Calling or a Road to Nationals or something like this and perform well with it, if provided that you had the reps, you had the practice, and you had the right build.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could. My thoughts. I think you could take any hero and do that, even Azalea. To be honest, if you're better than every opponent you play, you probably do all right. But Levia, I actually think, has the inherent power to be one of the strongest decks in the format. It's just it's just super difficult to play, and I think the builds maybe aren't quite right. It's really interesting to me though. I think we saw in the Devastation series, like, Levia get played. I know it only got 1 game, but then we never really saw anyone adopt that deck and play it, which is quite interesting, because I think probably, interestingly, if the devs put out decks, they're probably reasonable, and I know that I think Levia is one of Jason's favorites, so probably a pretty good deck list to look at if people are trying to find ideas. I know Hexagore has been popular with other people as well, and for good reason. It's a powerful weapon. Like, it has a really powerful effect, and you just need to find a way to utilize it.
Yeah, with Hexagore, so transition nicely into that one. But with Hexagore, what kind of builds do you see this in? Is Hexagore mostly, is it paired with kind of rolling Skazkins a lot more? Or what is the general use case for Hexagore? Is it after, Inherent Go-Again, whether it be on... what is the Screamer? Dread Screamer.
Dread Screamer,
yeah. So where do you see Hexagore? We don't see it much in the meta. If we do see Levia, it generally is with Claws, right? So talk to me about Hexagore.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do see a reasonable amount of Hexagore, but I think that's the perfect use case, right? Is that you want to be having 2 actions a turn. So what's the way to do that? Well, Dread Scream is probably the most optimal way because that also fuels your banish for Hexagore. If you're coming in with just Hexagore, I mean, the problem there is that you're not satisfying that blood debt cause that you need to for Levia. So Hexagore off 1 action is pretty unexciting, right? But off 2 actions, it's really powerful. Whether it be Dread Screamer. I mean, it does cost you 3 cards at the end of the day for 12, so it's actually not quite as good as you might think. But with something like a Scabskin Leathers, and you get to come in with maybe something like a Boneyard Mortar plus a Hexagore off a blue, that's 2 cards for 12 damage. That's pretty exciting. So I think my kind of challenge with Hexagore, I guess, is just first of all, getting it up to speed, so getting it to not be dealing you damage, and then also being able to utilize it while it not hurting you too much. But I actually think you don't need to be attacking with a Hexagore every single turn. But when you do, it can be a really powerful weapon. So yeah, I think Hexagore is good. I mean, it's majestic for a reason.
I wonder if it's interesting with like Primeval Bellow. So coming in for 11 off of just the pitch for 2, but then the discard obviously, but pretty decent rate to get to 11, right?
Yeah, but then if you're coming in for 6, you've presumably got 6 blood debt cards in your banish zone. Like, how are you?
And then you don't satisfy that.
Yeah, so that's the tough thing, right?
100%. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a more complicated weapon than it looks like on at first glance. And funny little anecdote here: I actually lost a pre-release to an opponent playing Hexagore, and I'd kind of brought it up. I was like, "Hey, I think it does damage to you," and he was like, "No, it does damage to you." And I was like, And in my infinite wisdom, I was like, "Okay, yeah, for sure." And so he just swung Hexagore at me every single turn for 6, didn't take any damage, and just blocked out his entire hand except for 1 card. Yeah, didn't win that one. I thought I was like, dude, I went through this.
Weapon.
Yeah, I went through this phase of just absolute depression for like 2 hours, where I was like, damn, they printed this card is so broken, they ruined the game. Like the limited format is just this is 10 times worse than Induction Chamber. And then he came up to me like towards the end of the event, he was like, hey, I actually read it wrong, and I was like, I'm not even mad. I'm just happy. I'm overjoyed that design has prevailed and we don't have this broken card. But yeah, if you're going to pre-release for Tales of Aria, especially in Vegas, make sure you read the cards.
Yeah, Brennan's lent to read.
Yeah, and if you're playing against me in Vegas, the Tales of Aria world premiere, you can tell me whatever you want on your card. I'll probably believe you, and even if I read it 20 times, I'll probably still believe you because I'm a potato.
Well, the problem is you didn't know how to read, right? But now you do, so hopefully we'll be okay.
That's quite an assumption, sir. Let's talk about one of your more favorite cards out of this set, or for Levia, and I think that's going to be Shadow of Blasphemous.
Yeah, let's
Shadow of Blasphemous.
Tie off a couple of cards and move on. Yeah, Shadow of Blasphemous for sure.
Is that it? No anecdotes on it? I mean, what do you usually fetch with it? I mean, what do you Shadow of Blasphemous has a more interesting piece to it. It has a part 2, right? Like you play the card, you successfully discard. What are you grabbing in Shadow of Blasphemous usually? Yeah,
no, sorry. I really like this card. I think it's I think it might be the best tutor we have in terms of if you just look at the power level of tutors in this game. A 6 attack, so it's a walking tutor effectively, right? 6 attack. You do have that clause you have to fulfill, so the discard of 6 attack, but I don't think that's overly difficult if the deck's built correctly, or if you're on your second cycle, it's you can always guarantee it. What am I finding? So it depends on the situation. Sometimes I would think that Desperate Evil is a reasonable find to just fulfill your blood debt. Then you have a 6 attack that you can play on a future turn alongside a banish off 2 actions. I would say like Tome of Torment is a card that I get reasonably often with Levia. Either if I have the actions that turn or to set up for a future turn. Howl is also a card I like to go and get as well. For the same reasons. Either I might have something like a Boneyard Mortar to play afterwards if I have 2 actions, or I will just set it up for a future turn. And then actually, I actually get Mutated Mass a reasonable amount of the time. There's these big turns that involve Shadow Blasphemous often in claws builds where you can, like if you have 2 actions, you're like Shadow into Claw into like a Mutated Mass for 6 is like really strong. So yeah, the cool thing about it, right, is that you have lots of different options. It's pretty toolboxy.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any other Majestics or Supers out of the set that pique your interest?
I think the one card I just wanted to mention is I think Graveling Growl is a pretty underrated card. I think that there's a lot of things you can do with that card. At red 1 for 7, it does require that setup, but there's a lot of ways for you to be banishing during your turn. It's a perfect card to be playing after a Dread Screamer, for instance. Again, goes back to that, 3-card hand for 13 damage. It's pretty good off a Dread Screamer into a Grevlin Growl with a blue. So yeah, lots of things that you can do with that card, and it's probably a little bit underutilized at the moment.
Yes, I feel like that card is nuts. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like that card is absolutely crazy. Like even off an Unworldly Bellow, if you don't have it, like if your graveyard isn't super saturated, which happens sometimes when you're playing Levia, like you may only have like the 3 to 5, and you banish with Unworldly Bellow, and you're able to come in for that 11 damage or something. But like you said, obviously off a Dread Screamer, it's just, it's icing on the cake. It's one of the best combos I think out of the these Monarch cards in Levia.
Yep.
Anyway, Hayden, any other cards you want to talk about before we move on?
I think we can move on. We'll talk a little bit more about Levia as we get into the how to play.
Awesome. So let's go into it. So how do we play it, Hayden? How do we play Rhinar, Levia, and sometimes KO?
Yeah, just thinking back if there's any of, I guess, archetypes that we haven't really talked about. We haven't really talked about KO that much. I guess if you look at, I might just try and tie that together now. If you're looking at the Blitz format, KO really is, I guess, about power. So, I guess the more turns that go by for KO, the more chances it has to, get these big attacks. But at the same time, if you have a couple of strong rolls on turn 1 or turn 2, you can actually just blow your opponents out pretty quickly. KO has some really strong tools to attack with. You can build these decks that are slightly more mid-rangey, but with really strong, just good 6 powers, like Command and Conquer, for instance, which even if it gets halved in attack, your opponent still needs to respect it and block it, otherwise they're going to lose their arsenal. Just cards like this. So KO, I think, very interesting in that format. It has some tools from Monarch that are worth looking at. Smash Big Tree, for instance, is a 2 cost for 7 that could be a 14 attack.
Tail in from Limb.
Tail in from Limb for sure. Yeah, really cool combo there, obviously, with being able to double the power.
It's funny. I actually think this may be a very casual viewpoint on me here, but I feel like KO was designed and printed for fun in mind, and designed and printed for a casual. Obviously, Blitz is a casual format, but I think that KO's design is more on like the pure fun side of things, rather than is this do we need to work out for a while? Like, is there like a very, very competitive deck here, or is this a deck that you just have fun on?
I think it's for those players who played Rhinar and played it as an RNG hero, right? Like, that's actually what I think it, in essence, is really a lot of it is about, is that it's almost like you have the brute that a lot of people thought Rhinar was, and you have KO for Blitz. That's kind of, I think that's to a big extent what it is.
Awesome. Well, Hayden, talk to me about how to structure turns. You could structure it as, Levia and Rhinar.
Yeah, brutes have some very similar ways, whether it be Levia or Rhinar, to structure the turns. It's going to depend on the type of deck that you're playing. So whether you're playing maybe like a claws build that's a lot more 5-card setup, whether you're playing a romping club build that's a lot more sort of grindy and mid-rangey that wants to actually pitch the deck and find like good like alpha rampage turns, maybe, or barraging beatdown turns, or similarly for Levia, with maybe starting that graveyard pretty early and then just going for it with like really strong attacks. There's a few different ways to play it, right? So it will depend, but one of the things that the things that you really have to consider, right? There's a few considerations when how to play and structure these turns is how you pay for additional costs. So, example, your discards. So if you're it's the start of the turn cycle, you're defending against your opponent. When you're planning out how to play your hand on your turn, you've got to really consider these additional costs and the trade-off that you're making. So if you look at Rhinar, for example, that additional discard is potentially a card that you could have defended with. So what's the trade-off cost there? Are you better off maybe in this turn blocking with the action card that you want to play plus the additional cost that you're probably going to have to play, and then just use the pitch card to come in with your club, for instance? So all these sort of trade-offs you have to consider, and it's the same with Levia, right? Like the cards in your graveyard are like a utility, right? So if you start banishing those, like, what does your graveyard look like? So if you're like, I'm going to come with a Dread Screamer this turn, and then I've got, Hexagore to follow it up. Well, I look at my graveyard and I've got, 3 6 attacks, and I've got 9 non-6 attacks. Is that Dread Screamer really going to trigger right here? So you need to start considering things like that. So the additional costs are a really important consideration for brutes. With a lot of the builds, you might be looking to find these important 5-card hands with cards like Bloodrush Bellow, Art of War, for instance, in Levia, Alpha Rampage with Rhinar. Maybe you're trying to set up multiple barraging beatdowns. So you need to consider, are you going to be looking to pitch to set up big turns, or are you just looking to use your arsenal to set up big turns? But I think the main one of the most key things that Brute, I think, teaches players, and as you play that class more, is that 5-card hands aren't created equal. One 5-card hand compared to another 5-card hand can be completely different, especially when you start factoring in all the additional costs, the need for action points. You could have a Blood Rush Bellows hand that has, 1 blue and like 3 red 6 attacks versus maybe one that has, Beast Within has multiple yellows that are going to enable you to fuel your turn with extra resources if you draw into more reds. So yeah, not all 5-card hands are created equal, and I think that's something that people sort of need to weigh up. One of the traps you can fall into, right, is that I'm playing Brute, I'm setting up a Blood Rush Bellow turn, I put it into Arsenal, I draw my next hand, I've got a blue and I've got two 6 attacks. Yeah, I'm going to go for it like immediately. Whereas it might not be the right hand, or it might not be even the right turn to do it.
Yeah, I think that Brute teaches players very fundamental concepts of the game as well, which is setting up 5-card hands, setting up big turns rather than just playing hand to hand. Because if you do play your kind of 4-card hand to 4-card hand, or even just don't consider the threat density that's left in your deck and what you're actually playing towards, and then obviously the level past that as well. It's like you cycle back to your deck and play to those outs. You're just not gonna have a good time on Brute. That's, I think, one of the pillars that makes Brute a more complicated class, is that its 4-card hands are decently underwhelming most of the time, where its 5-card hands can be absolutely devastating.
Yeah, and your game plans aren't actually that linear, to be honest, because you have, especially with Rhinar, actually, you have whether it be like Club or Claws. So with Club, probably a bit more grindy, with Claws, a bit more setup. But you also have things like Barrage and Beatdown, right, where that card in multiples basically is like a power turn, right? Your opponent can't do anything about it because you intimidate. But in like as a single copy of Barrage and Beatdown, that card can actually be effective to draw cards out of your opponent's hand. So you're making these decisions about what you need your cards to do in every matchup, and they actually need to do different things in certain matchups. So, the Barrage and Beatdown, I think, is a perfect example. Against aggressive decks, you want that to be like pulling cards from your opponent's hand, stopping them from being able to play 5-card hands and powerful hands. And against, control decks, probably what you want that to be doing is you don't want to be pulling cards from their hand, because that's what they want to do. They want to block. You actually want that to be taking cards that they want to defend with out of their hand. So stacking those with multiple intimidates is like where it's really important. So yeah, there's just a lot of, I think flexibility is the really key thing with Brutes, especially with Rhinar. And it's a lot, it really comes down to how you play the game.
Yeah.
Cool. Next sort of thing to consider when we're thinking about playing out turns. Yeah, so this is 5-card hands, but then also you've got the classic game state, which is like winning turn cycles, which can be really important for Brutes as well, whether that actually be Levia or Rhinar. Both of those are really classes that are happy to win a turn cycle, especially for Levia early on. So that really comes down to just getting the best net damage out of your hands, whether that's say blocking with 3 cards and then pitching a yellow to come with Romping Club for 4. So that's 13 damage, right? So if you're blocking out 9 for your opponent's turn, coming in for 4, you're probably going to win that turn cycle unless your opponent has a really big turn. And you're looking to get either closer to the right 5-card hands, as we talk about, or you're getting closer to pitching and setting up your deck, or with Levia, you're filling up your grave, ready to start hitting the gas pedal next turn. So playing this sort of classic winner turn cycle is actually something that Brute does very well, and because of the weapons, and also the fact that just basically all your cards block for 3. A little bit less so with Levia now, obviously, in the format, but with traditional Brute decks. I do want to say, the way to play it, if we talk about how to structure turns, it's not an RNG class. If you are relying purely on RNG, you're going to find yourself in trouble. Like we said, Scab Skins is a really important tool and something to really manage. But you can lose a lot with it if you're not careful. But if you are in a position where it's really low risk to use it, so the upside is heavily outweighs the downside, or the opportunity cost is really low, so the turn you're going to have just wouldn't impact the game state, because maybe your opponent can just block with 1 card and probably still do the thing that they were going to do anyway. Those are the times where Scab Skin becomes like a really important tool. And it's actually the same with discards, right? If you have built your deck the right way, then the random discards aren't going to punish you as much. So you're not going to find that you draw these awkward hands that just don't have enough 6 attacks in them, because you've built the deck right. So on the first cycle, you're going to just on average draw a better number of 6 attacks, and then on the second cycle of the deck, you've pitched yellow cards, you've pitched Wrecker Romps, things like that. So your deck's still going to have these 6 attacks in them. So that's, deck building is really important with Brute. And to be honest, it's important with every class. I think it's just a lot more obvious with Brute, because you have these really clear constraints about the cards that you need to find. Whereas maybe, I don't know, if you take a class like Dorinthia, you can misbuild that to not have the right number of non-attacks or right number of resources, but you can kind of get away with it a little bit. It doesn't punish you as much. You can still do things with your turn, still play powerful hands out. Any thoughts, Brendan, before we move on to sort of more, I guess, macro strategies of the decks?
Yeah, I mean, let's sort of iterate and expand upon in brevity how the deck actually plays out.
Yeah, okay. So in almost every single build, your pitch is going to be very important, because you will often cycle through, and you will also often cycle through faster than a lot of other decks in the format, because you're doing things like drawing and discarding. You've got Bloodrush Bellow. You're utilizing your hands a lot more to either block and then come back. So you'll see that you can get through your second cycle generally quicker than a lot of other core decks. Obviously things like Chain and stuff now, those can really get through the deck. But so how you pitch your deck is often going to be super important. Actually, even to the extent with, I didn't think this as much with Levia, but actually in a lot of matchups with Levia, this is also super important, especially against decks where maybe you're sort of bringing some defense reactions, or you're playing a bit more of a, present attacks and defend a bit, and then you're probably going to come back through your second cycle against decks like Guardian, for instance. I think it's still super key. We already talked about flexibility, right, Brendan? And that's one of the key words that I really associate with the Brute class, is that you have flexibility in ways that you can win the game. But you do have a limited amount of damage in basically every Brute deck. So I think about cards like Barraging Beatdown. The more of those you burn through in a Rhinar deck or Bloodrush Bellows, that's a lot of damage going from your deck. If you're out of Alpha Rampages, Barraging Beatdowns, and Bloodrush Bellows, and your opponent knows about it, you're going to find it very difficult to find enough damage to win that game, right?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. We talked about this a little bit before, but Barraging Beatdown is really interesting because, I mean, it's probably technically incorrect to say exponentially better, but, if you're playing against a control deck or a deck that, would be okay with blocking with you, getting down to where they only have that one card in hand is pretty good. And Barraging Beatdown outside of that is actually kind of bad sometimes. Whereas if you're playing against an aggro deck or a deck that doesn't want to block you at all, wants to play 5-card hands, just playing one Barraging Beatdown sometimes and throwing it on a weapon or on an attack and forcing them to throw 2 cards in front of it can be a really useful tool for slowing down some of those faster decks.
Yeah, and that's where the flexibility keyword comes in, I think, right? And the adaptability is that your cards are going to do different things in different matchups, and Intimidate is sometimes going to be really important, and in other times it's not going to be important. But the way you can use Intimidate to be important is in different ways. So like you say, if against a control deck, like intimidating every card of their hand is like super impactful, because every card in their hand wants to be defensive. And so you're saying, okay, you can't execute the game plan you want to execute. And then on the flip side, against aggro decks, you're saying, okay, well, I'm just going to intimidate a random card from your hand, and now I'm going to present you with 8 damage with a red Barraging Beatdown and a club off 2 cards. And if you don't block with 2 cards, then I'm getting a really good return rate on my damage, which is probably going to be close to helping me keep up with you. And if you do block, well, hopefully I intimidated the card that you would have preferred to have blocked with. So yeah, it's a really interesting how you use Intimidate. You've just got to kind of think about that, and it depends on the matchup. But there is certainly, I just want to go back to, there's a limited amount of damage in these decks. Maybe Levia has a bit more with power cards, but if you've played some longer games with Levia, you probably see as well there really is a limited amount of damage in that deck as well. You run out of Art of Wars, Dread Screamers, Bloodrush Bellow, can certainly make it difficult.
100%. So, yeah. And to kind of culminate all of that and tie all up, just in the brief points, how do we ultimately win with Brute? We know the 5-card hands, we know the Intimidate, we have the Evasion on the deck, but ultimately, how do these decks kind of end up closing out the game?
Yeah, well, we know, Brendan, you just roll Scabs and Leathers and you hit the 6.
Yeah, absolutely not. And Levia is also unplayably bad. There's so many things that are commonly believed by a lot of people that are not incorrect. So
yeah, how do we win with Brute? So the biggest thing, so I'm just going to go back to that keyword, which is like flexibility. So the best way to win with Brute is to identify the weakness of the opposing hero and look to adapt your game plan to that. So this is where, like, especially in Classic Constructed, your 80 cards really comes into play. But also just the adaptability of your cards that are probably in your core deck, like a Barraging Beatdown, like some of your 6 attacks. So you're looking to work out what your opponent's trying to do. So we already talked about like using Intimidate versus aggressive decks versus using Intimidate against control decks, but that can sort of branch out to the weapons as well. So Romping Club, for instance, can be a really fantastic weapon against the more aggressive decks, the decks that where the game plan might be to sort of like grind a little bit more, be like get cards in blocking, come in with a club, try and get them into the mid game so you can take over with a couple of really powerful hands. Give yourself some time. Whereas versus, maybe like these more setup based decks, so you're playing against a 5-card hand deck or you're playing against a control deck where like Mandible Claws, for instance, could be the way to go because you get to go wider, you get to set up bigger 5-card turns, you get to set up more damage in your turns. That can be really important. So yeah, you're really looking to understand what your opponent's trying to do and then adapt your game plan for that. The one thing, and we're gonna talk about this in sort of our strengths and weaknesses section, but Brute is really good at being in the middle. Like it can really play really well in the middle and sort of step either side of the line. What it doesn't do well is be like the extremes. So it's never going to be the best aggressive deck and it's never going to be the best control deck. So you want to play to your strengths in the middle and just step to either side of the line depending on how you're targeting the opposing hero. And along that lines, you want to play to actively disrupt your opponent's plans as well. So that's what makes Intimidate so strong, is that because it does disrupt your opponent. They can't defend optimally. You get to put damage in that, maybe they do need to block some of it, but then they can't do it in the way they want to. I think we've talked about this enough. But I guess where that does line up as well in terms of disrupting your opponent is if on the second cycle, if you are watching what your opponent's doing through the first cycle and you know what sort of turns they're trying to set up into the late game, especially if you're playing quite defensive on the first cycle. Let's take like Dorinthia, for example. If they're setting up, a Ironsong Determination plus Steelblade Supremacy turn, okay, well, how can you maybe disrupt that on the second cycle? Is it to the turn before they do that, find a hand that intimidates, most of their cards so that they can't block out and then back-to-back take damage on their turns? Things like this, which are really important. And then just, thirdly is managing that perceived like RNG or those random aspects of the class. The class has powerful cards and effects, and there is certainly, some additional costs or some downsides to those, and it's really about managing those, using that sort of, RNG aspects as a tool, not a clutch to lean on. If you play to the RNG and just try and high roll, you're going to lose so many winnable matches that you could have with the Brute, because you just chose not to play Flesh and Blood effectively.
Yeah, and I'm going to lead us off heading into our patented strengths and weaknesses here. So I think you've heard it both said literally and emulated through many concepts. The Brute is a flexible class. It can heavily adapt to its opponent, but it can also enforce its own game plan. Brute, sometimes it forces the opponent to interact, and sometimes it forces the opponent to not interact through things like Intimidate. It's really, really strong. I think the Brute is also kind of unique in the way it's able to speed up and change its plan during the game. It can be a deck that it can put out a lot of damage in the early game, sometimes in the mid game, but it can also set up a very, very nice second cycle through the deck, whether that's through Blood Rush Bellows, multiple Blood Rush Bellows, and things like this. So Brute is just really flexible and very dynamic into what the opponent is doing, which makes it a very strong deck and a very interesting and intriguing deck for higher skill players to hop on.
Yep, definitely. What next, Brendan? I guess we talked about Scabskin Leathers, and that is a strength of this deck. It's a great tool, but it's not a crutch. It's something to master, and when you're used correctly, it can just be one of the strongest legendary equipments in this game. You've got the impact of Gambler's Gloves, which we actually didn't really talk about too much in this deep dive, but Gambler's Gloves coming with Crucible of War is like a really interesting sort of addition to the Scabskin Leathers. It's a card that helps you. I would say it helps augment the use of Scabskin Leathers. It doesn't mean that you just I can go to the bank from turn one because I have the Scabskin Leathers as a backup plan. Although I do actually think in certain matchups that strategy is viable, is to be really aggressive with your Scabskin Leathers early on because of Gambler's Gloves. But in general, what you're going to find that it's used for is to help you with like key turns. So maybe I want to it's still trading off that cost versus the benefits. So okay, I have a turn where Scabskin Leathers could benefit me here. Okay, I roll the 1, but you know what? I'm only losing 4 damage. There's no point in re-rolling that, right? But okay, I come to the mid game. I have a 20 damage turn here. That's gonna it's my pivot turn. It's really gonna put all the emphasis on myself, and it's gonna push my opponent probably close to being out of the game. I need to scab skins to get the extra action, that's when Gambler's Gloves can be like super important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about Intimidate being very hard to play around. Obviously, it is a random banish for that part of the turn on your opponent's end. But I think the more interesting use case with this is when you do it against a deck that's either aggressive or trying to play a 5-card hand, and you do make them block with 2 cards to be able to block an attack that's coming in for a lot of damage at a very reduced rate, which is what Barraging Beatdown will do. So, attacking a Katsu deck or a chain deck, and forcing them to put 2 cards in front of it when they would be usually okay with taking some damage and kind of eating that attack, you make them kind of dance with the question of how worth it and how much damage am I willing to take to preserve the integrity of this 5-card hand.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Intimidate. That's one of the biggest strengths of. Sorry, you said Intimidate. The last one I want to talk about, Brendan, is in terms of strength, is like the weapons you have at your disposal. So I think actually I should check this, but Brute in essence should have the most weapons right now, right? Between you got the Medax, you've got the Hexagore that have just come in, you've got the Romping Club and the Mandible Claws. So four different options of weapons if you're, I guess, playing Levia. 3 if you're playing...
Does Warrior maybe? Because Hashirabati, Hashimai are 2 different weapons.
Oh, I'm counting them as one. I'm just counting them as one. Because I counted the Mandible Claws as one.
Cheeky.
Plus Centauri, but they got Centauri Sabers, Raiden, and so they're similar as well. But yeah, so you've got a bit of a war chest of weapons, regardless of what Brute you're playing. And if you're playing Levia, you've got a lot of options at your disposal there. And there's probably cases I wouldn't be surprised to see where Brute wants to play more than one weapon. I've definitely in Crucible was playing both Mandible Claws and Romping Club for different matchups, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see Livia's playing Medax for those matchups where you can't fill your graveyard, for instance, as an option alongside maybe like the Hexagore as their key weapon or the Mandible Claws. So, yeah.
For sure. And heading into the weaknesses, I know that we have, we have kind of tried to dispel some of the misbeliefs around the RNG with the class, but there is RNG. I think it's important to keep in mind that every class in Flesh and Blood does have RNG to an extent. And the reason why the perception is disproportionate to the actual amount when it comes to Brute is because it's just way more apparent, right? You can look at Scabskin Leathers and you can say, oh, I have to roll, X amount to make it decent, and I can low roll in this way. This exists in other classes as well. In Katsu, that may be not drawing your combo pieces, and in Chain, that's drawing a full hand of non-attack actions or something like that. There are plenty of other instances of RNG, but in Brute, it's just way more apparent. It's like literally printed on the card. But that being said, Brute at the end of the day can be a lower variance class, and you can drastically reduce that so-called RNG.
Yeah, I would actually even turn this point into the fact that one of the weaknesses of Brute is that it's actually very difficult to play and to control that RNG aspect, because take that Katsu example, for instance. If you don't draw your combo piece, or you draw a quad red hand, draw no blues, and you can't Kadachi, then that's the variance that your deck has given you on the first cycle. With Brute, a lot of the variance can actually be controlled, so you can actually be actively setting up your hands to make sure that you have your 6 attacks, or you have the cards, the right card in the arsenal at the right time. And so a lot of games can feel like, I just got so unlucky. But if you look at it, you go, well, actually, if I had kept that 6 attack here, or I'd arsenaled that card differently, or I hadn't arsenaled this card that required an additional cost in my arsenal, there's all these different things that come into consideration. So I think the difficult thing for Brute is, and one of the weaknesses is just the difficulty to structure the turns to get the most out of the deck. And I think that's even more so true with Levia, to be honest, because of that extra zone you have to manage as well.
100%. And I think an important thing to talk about Brute is that your deck often does have a certain amount of power cards. These are things like Blood Rush Bellow, Alpha Rampage, Dread Screamers, Barraging Beatdowns, etc. And you can go through a game and expend a decent amount of these and kind of come up with a very, very weak deck as you get closer to your second cycle, or even play your second cycle. This is apparent in a lot of other decks, but in Brute, you can really feel like you have a wet noodle sometimes as you head into the mid to late and the late game.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's weird. Like with decks like Katsu, for instance, when you run out of damage, you run out of damage, right? Like you run out of reds, and that's kind of the game. Unless Kadachis can carry you through because your opponent's on a low life total. It's like if you get to 10, 12 damage and you're with Brute and you've run out of your power cards, the problem is you don't have ways to like set up more than 12 damage a turn usually, and that's what you need in order to finish off games, right? That's why I think actually a card like Reckless Swing, the defense reaction could be a reasonable win condition. Weaknesses. Brennan just wanted to tie up. We kind of talked about these already with the you don't excel at any one particular game plan amazingly, so you're never going to be the best aggro deck, you're never going to be the best control deck. That is definitely a weakness, right? Like, so if you're in a format that's the better decks are going to be really polarizing. It can be really difficult for you because you find a struggle to play on a field where you need to be on either end of the spectrum. And the deck building side of it. So it only takes a few sort of, I guess, choices in the deck to skew the deck from what it needs to be. The ability to pay for those additional costs, the ability to have enough 6 attacks, things like that, and the deck can really go off the rails. So I think that's a bit of weakness of the deck as well, or the class.
100%. So Hayden, let's breeze through our matchups. I know Brute's a little bit more complicated. I think we're gonna kind of ignore KO for this one. So coming into, let's just classic constructed here, Levia and Rhinar. Maybe some anecdotes about Blitz. Let's get into it.
Yep, let's go through it. So, Rhinar, if we talk about mirrors, the mirrors are a bit interesting. This is probably the one match where some of the RNG does come into it a little bit. Maybe more so with Levia. I think with the traditional Rhinar decks, you are looking to just like set up, play pretty aggressively, get your turns going. This is where the 5-card builds, though, do tend to play better. Talk about Dorinthia. This is a pretty timeless matchup, to be honest. I played a lot of Dorinthia versus Rhinar or Brute in Welcome to Wraith. It can be a real back and forth. It's actually, I think, gone between, being like really heavily Dorinthia favored, being Rhinar favored, being close matchup. And I think the play style and the cards available have really come into that. I think with Crucible, the styles of deck that were being played, I think Brute had sort of the upper hand. Quite interestingly, not sure where it maybe sits now. I think in general, though, if you've got your deck built as a Brute to have some number of defense reactions, to be willing to be patient into the mid game. Mid game is often where Brute does its thing, right? So early game, you maybe need to be like either setting up a card in arsenal or setting up the bottom of your deck. Once you get through into the mid game, that's when you can really sort of pay dividends. And if you've set up your deck correctly, the start of the late game can be really key for you as well. And I think no more so than in Dorinthia, you need to manage their damage, and then look to maybe use barrage and beatdowns like we talked about to draw some cards out of their hand, and maybe get through to mid game with some Bella's turns, etc. One of the ways you can play, for instance, Rhinar into this matchup as well is you can actually play like that aggressive Scabskins plan for early damage and then look to manage the game from there. So maybe you go really heavy on the Scabskins turn 1, 2, and 3. Look to push damage. Maybe that ends up breaking your Gambler's Gloves, and then from there you're looking to just manage the game out, take your life lead into the mid and late game and see it through.
100%. And for the little bit of Blitz anecdotes we do have to always talk about Ira, a very, very popular deck in Blitz right now, and probably until that deck does head into the Living Legend status. But Rhinar versus Ira, it's actually a pretty interesting matchup because I don't think it's incredibly favored for Ira. I definitely think that Ira is favored, but I feel like this match kind of centers around effective Blood Rush Bellow turns. As well as, in Blitz, it's really interesting how quickly you can play to that Reckless Swing endgame as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if we talk about Rhinar specifically, Blood Rush Bellow is really key in the Ira match. For Levia, I think you've got a bit more play to it because you can deal, I think, more damage in the sort of start to early to mid game just by sort of snowballing your turns. But the thing that Ira does well, right, is really take over from the mid to late game with their sigils, with the defense reactions, just with the Kadachi chips. So that's where that game needs to be played, is in the early to mid game.
100%. And I think into someone that's very, very close to my heart, Mr. Kano. So for Kano, this is a really, really tough matchup, both in Blitz, and I would assume that this concept also extends into Classic Constructed to the same extent, is that as Rhinar, as soon as you kind of play, I'm not sure about Levia here, but as Rhinar, as soon as you play your first card, the Kano really has to make a decision. As soon as that first Intimidate comes out, they have to decide whether they're going to do something on that turn and try to punish you, or they're just going to kind of take it all and let the cards fall while they fall. And that's really hard as Kano. Kano is a deck that operates 100% off of information. The more that they have, the more they can do. It's all about risk management on that deck. So Rhinar just kind of throws that out the window and then makes you make that with the first card that plops onto the table, which is sometimes Barrage and Beatdown, and that's just one card from hand or one card from arsenal, nothing else. So presenting an immense amount of unknown information to the Kano player and threatening so many different decision trees and play lines that could possibly happen.
Yeah, the Skull Horn I think is really key for that in terms of having that Arcane Barrier 2 on a headpiece, which is, the headpiece isn't really important for Brute anyway, so that's really helpful. I would say that, to be honest, like Rhinar versus Kano, whether it be Blitz or CC, I think Kanos have gotten a lot better at playing this matchup, and it's not, it used to be like, as a Kano player, you didn't want to see Rhinar in Classic Constructed. I think that's less of a case, and even in Blitz, I remember from testing for the Blitz calling with some of my friends that it didn't end up being as bad a matchup as maybe we thought. I still thought that Rhinar was favored, but I know I had Kano playing friends that thought like Kano was favored. So really interesting. And then I think Levia actually has a tough time into Kano, to be honest, because you don't have that intimidate factor, literally. So it's a lot easier to play into just the raw damage of Levia decks, which is, and you're not blocking as well. You're not helping them fill that grave from turn one. Not playing actions for them to block. So yeah, really interesting. Going to Bravo, another classic matchup alongside Dorinthia from Welcome to Wraith. Usually it's been sort of Bravo favored to 50-50. I think the toughest thing for Brutes, right, is that Bravo can switch between that sort of more defensive deck and a more aggressive deck, and that's really, or more proactive deck, which is really difficult for Brutes to deal with, because Brute can come in with their big crush effects, and then you're having to find defensive turns, and then all of a sudden you're trying to set up your turn or come in with attacks, and they're more than happy to block it out. They can get a defense reaction to Arsenal. They transition a bit better than you. It's really hard if you're trying to play like a Mandible Claws plan or like a Blood Rush Bellow plan to have defense reactions in, because it's just it's less 6 attacks, whereas they don't really have those constraints that you do around sort of some of the deck building. So yeah, it can be quite a tough matchup, especially if the Bravo player knows what they're doing. You really need to sort of I guess try and get ahead in the early game a bit, sort of prevent those big crush effects, protect your life, and then find your setup turns and try and have them line up against turns where your opponent isn't trying to crush you.
Mm-hmm. And onto Azalea. So Azalea is actually pretty interesting into Rhinar. Azalea doesn't care too much about Intimidate. They're also able to play on fewer card hands a lot better than a lot of heroes. Azalea specifically, we'll see how the Future Ranger does, but Azalea able to threaten some serious on-hit triggers and some decent damage usually out of 2 cards, and then off of 3 cards that can have kind of a full-blown turn on you.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. I didn't really like playing this matchup as a Rhinar. If the Azalea player was was good and knew what they're doing, it could be quite tough. And I think Levia has a better matchup because it just it just has good damage effects, can have them repeatable, and it blocks pretty well. But yeah, talk about Viserai. It's really interesting. So Rhinar can have a pretty good time in this matchup if it's like the OTK builds, because Intimidate becomes such an important factor, and basically you're denying them their game plan that they want to do, which is defend and set up rune chance by using Intimidate. With like more mid-range Viserai decks, I think that can be really close, and then it's both sort of players trying to find their 5-card hands and looking to grind a little bit into the mid game. With Levia, they can struggle a little bit more on the flip side against the OTK, because basically Levia wants like decks to interact with them to some amount, right? It doesn't have Intimidate. It can put up pretty big damage, but it does like a little bit of interaction. So against mid-range, though, I think Viserai is in a lot better position, because you basically just do that mid-range sort of game plan a lot better than Viserai does.
Yeah, and if we head into Mechanologist or Dash, it's a really interesting matchup, especially from the Rhino perspective, and Hayden will have a plethora of thoughts about this. But against traditional Dash control, the Rhino, in my opinion, is very, very favored, especially because that card Arg Smash.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to play Rhino into nowadays, like the current iteration of Dash we see, which is very more mid-rangey and actually can boost a lot and go kind of aggro, it seems like the matchup is less for Rhino, not less as how you would be into control, but still probably not Dash favorite, because Arc Smash is still an incredible card. Like blasting up all the potential items on the board and getting rid of all chambers, even if it is a more boost Dash, is really, really good. But if they are just kind of boosting into your face, it does feel a bit harder than if they have a just completely passive and reactive plan like the control deck does.
Yeah, one of the most important things about Flesh and Blood is that any hero can be any hero if the decks are set up correctly, right? Like if you have this game plan you've crafted, you can actually, there's no matchup where it's like, oh, this is unwinnable. And of course, Arc Smash is like a really powerful card, but there's ways that the mech can play around that. You can go watch the gameplay where I played Dash into Rhinar and Levia, where I lost my induction chambers, but I set up plasma purifiers. Like there's game plans you can play into it that matter. So I would say it's traditionally, because of cards like Arc Smash, because of game plans, it's traditionally mech favored. I actually think I prefer, now with the way mechs are playing in this more mid-range build, I actually prefer to play Levia into that. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting matchup. It's a matchup that I really enjoy playing as well, actually.
All right, Hayden. Now for a very interesting matchup, Levia versus Rhinar. I know that you're kind of the mastermind, or not the mastermind, but you're a big fan of both decks, so lay this one out for me.
Yeah, I mean, I just would prefer to be on the Levia side, to be honest. So again, that's that thing where Levia likes playing into more mid-range decks that are trying to, do want to interact with you to some degree, and Rhinar, does want to try and mess up those hands, but at the same time, if Rhinar comes in with some intimidate effects, Levia can be in a position to just kind of take that, because your damage output is often a lot better with Levia. So I think in all sort of the way that the games can go, Levia's almost always sort of has a bit of favorability on their side, as you go into that mid game, especially. Talk about Bolton, can definitely be a tougher, I think, because you have a lot of attacks in your deck. Triggering that Sir Bolton hero ability, it can often become kind of attrition based, and they have their soul that they can build up. They can set up some really powerful turns, and they can be a bit scary for you. As well as like they do want to play out 5 cards a reasonable amount of the time. So if you're intimidating multiple cards from the hand, they don't really care. It's those, again, comes back to that, like playing a barrage and beat down and coming in with like a club that can really sort of put them on the back foot. But Bolton and Katsu traditionally, like for Rhinar, for instance, have been 2 of the tougher matchups. And to be honest, I think it's the same for Levia. Like those extremes are where it can be really difficult. And in the OTK deck, that can be kind of scary as well. Although if you're playing Rhinar, maybe a little bit less so, because you don't let them sort of preserve their life total like they might want to.
Yeah, and then talking about Prism, the edition, somewhat popular edition that was in Monarch, of course, is, I think Brute is kind of if we talk about any hero having a specific advantage over another, any class over another, I think Brute over Illusionist right now is probably one of the strongest ones. It's just like, if you think about why Guardian can have a tough matchup into Prism, is because they can land multiple auras on you. But in Brute, you kind of have like a get out of jail free card, if that does happen, in the form of the Scab Skin Leathers. So very, very nice. And obviously you're popping all their, a lot of their Heralds, or, Spectras, or whatever it may be, Phantasm, with your 6 attacks. So I think you're really, really favored on both Brutes for this. And yeah, the Scab Skin Leather is able to get you out of multiple auras. Is very, very nice.
Yeah, you can really use that Scab Skin as the plan you need to, right? Which is not the crutch, but just it can be a bit of a backup plan sometimes. But if the Prism plan is they're doing, like there is obviously game plans they can play to, but I would say inherently it does favor the Brute.
Yeah, and finally, the boogeyman of the format, that is Chain. So if we're going to talk about Chain versus Brute, we can just call upon the wise words of developer Jason Chung. And he said recently in his breakdown after the devastation that Levia is actually quite good into Chain, because Chain doesn't like big damage, and Levia can put out just massive amounts of damage. Rhinar can also kind of do the same thing. I've tested Rhinar versus Chain a little bit myself. Feels not so good for the Rhinar.
Yeah,
but
I hate that matchup.
Levia, on the other hand, I would say that a lot of people didn't pay enough credence to what Jason Chung said, and there's probably more there than you think.
Agree.
Levia into Chain is, I don't want to say too much about it, but yeah, presenting a ton of damage to a Chain is it's not something that they enjoy. That's for sure. But Hayden, before we close out, talk to me about Rhinar versus Katsu.
Yes, Rhinar versus Katsu, which we did miss. So we talked a bit about with Bolton. I did say that the Katsu and Bolton are matchups that traditionally Brutes don't favor because of the aggressive nature. You're really looking to, I guess, in those matchups, grind a little bit get yourself into the mid game to find some hands, because they're going to come full steam ahead at you from turn 1. And if you get yourself on the back foot, you start leaking damage, and you're pushing back not great damage. You're just going to lose the game pretty quickly into the mid game. So cards like barrage and beat down for Rhinar are really key. For Levia, really comes down to like your like out of war turns and setting up these big attacks, and using probably Husk to help you get into that game spot. So yeah, it's a tougher matchup, I think, in general, the sort of just against Ninja. But Brendan, I'm just gonna. Oh, sorry.
Yep. What was that, Hayden? Before you rudely interrupted me.
Sorry, I did. I was just going to say, I think it's time to talk quickly about how to beat Brute in Constructed, and then
about to say too.
And tie it up. Yeah, right. I'll roll into it. So basically, we've talked a lot about just the macro game plans, and like it's so important for Brute to do things well. So really try and mitigate those RNG aspects. Set up these key turns, pitch well, and really try and adapt to what your opponent's doing and disrupt them. So if you want to beat Brute and Classic Constructed, well, they're going to play the in-between, right? So they're going to do it almost better than anyone else. But if you are on the scales, I guess especially the aggressive edge of the scale, it's really difficult for Brute in general to deal with that. So that's where, like Katsu with on-hit effects and an aggressive game plan is like quite difficult for them to deal with. And then the other piece that can be difficult to deal with and how to beat them is being able to, I guess, transition between, on-hit effects, so really powerful things that they want to block out, and also just being able to, turtle up a little bit and come in with like a hammer for 6 on their turns. So it's really difficult for, I think, Brute doesn't love playing into Guardian in general and doesn't love playing into Ninja in general for those sort of reasons. Because you can spoil their setups as well. So you identify the turn where they're setting up their Blood Rush Bellows, and you come in with your your surging to whelming and force them to block, or you come with your crippling crush, things like that. Talk about Brute and Blitz. You just want to limit the power of their Intimidate and kill them early. The longer you let the game go, and because of the low life totals and in that format, the more time you give them to set up their turns, and that is where Brute really wants to set up, is in that format. Just find those big damage turns, sort of punch in the face and get out and done. So decks like Dorinthia, Ira, Kano, even Chain, they can sort of have these big burst turns early is really important. And as well, some of those decks have really strong equipment in the form of Dorinthia and Chain, which can be really powerful because it's just going to be straight damage from the Brute decks.
100%. Well, thank you so much, Hayden. That does conclude our deep dive, or 101 on the Brute class. Let us know in the comments if this is something you enjoy. It has seemed to be a bit of a hit for us, so shoot us with what you would like to see next. We do have a lot of very exciting topics coming as well with the release of Tales of Aria. We have our first calling. There's just so many things going on in Flesh and Blood right now, and I'm super excited. Just want to shout out our YouTube page, which is Arsenal Pass. We have been doing a big focus on YouTube recently, so we do have curated times in which we're uploading gameplay every week, deck techs, as well as this podcast and our sub podcast, Time in the Round, which is a version of this that is much more free form, and we kind of talk about me and Hayden's viewpoints on the game and more about our personal experiences. So go check that out. It is YouTube exclusive, and again, it is at Arsenal Pass. And thanks so much for everybody who has subscribed to us over the past couple of months. It has been an awesome time of growth for us. Just want to shout out our Twitter pages. Me and Hayden, the boomers of Flesh and Blood, have figured out how to use Twitter. So I am located at the Fiddy Shades, so THE Fiddy Shades, FIDDYSHADES, kind of like that really popular novel. And Hayden is at Fjendale, so FYEN_Dale, kind of like Toma Fjendal and his last name. So go check us out. We actually did a raffle for the extended art Herald of Protections. We did 5 play sets and the playmat. Those winners were actually chosen today at the recording of this podcast. So congratulations to those winners. But check us out because we love engaging with the community, and we do little fun giveaways in there and stuff like that. Have to shout out our Patreon. Super big thank you to all of our patrons. We've had an incredible outpouring of support since we opened the Patreon, and it's been an awesome thing to see, and it's very, very encouraging. If you are interested in the Patreon, what we do provide on there is very in-depth and detailed deck guides. So that comes with, your deck list, of course, but then your sideboard list, your deck theory, your math, your ratios, everything you need to take that deck and be competitive as soon as possible. We also have a Patreon-only podcast, the one of which I think by the time this goes out, will have been uploaded. And that is the 3 things you need to win a calling. With that, Hayden, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you all for listening, and we will see you all next week.
Yeah, see you later, guys. Bye.